It is my pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker of the convention, Kevin Kosar, Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Kevin studies the U.S. Congress, the administrative state, American politics, and the election reform. He is also the editor of UnderstandingCongress.org. Kevin has penned several books on politics and policy, including titles such as Congress Overwhelmed: The Decline in Congressional Capacity and Prospects for Reform, Failing Grades: The Federal Politics of Education Standards, as well as Moonshine: A Global History, and Whiskey: A Global History. Now that's what I call a well-rounded library. Kevin has a master's and doctorate in politics from New York University and a bachelor's degree in political science from the Ohio State University. I'm looking forward to hearing what Kevin has to say about our political climate and the prospects for the general election. So please join me in welcoming to the stage Kevin Kosar.
Well, all right, good morning, good morning. Yes, I heard a few chuckles when the end of my biography was read. It often creates a little dissonance when you think, all right, here's some guy who studies elections and Congress, one of those, academic nerd guys. So why is he writing about hooch? Well, if you think a little bit longer, there's a connection. You spend 20 years in Washington, D.C., as I have, studying Congress and elections. It's no surprise that I should be attracted to strong drink. So, speaking of the causes of our governance dysfunction, I want to talk about election reform in particular. Now, you've probably seen tons and tons of headlines and news about squabbles around aspects of our election. How much early voting should we have? How much voting by mail will we have? Should we have some sort of voter ID system? How robust should it be? How forgiving should it be? These I put in the bucket of stuff I call election administration. They're basically fights about the current system we have and how do we tweak it. The subject of what I'm talking about is something bigger, something that doesn't quite get as many headlines, and that's systemic election reform. And I think it should be of interest to a crowd who knows a whole lot about building structures to channel forces and to withstand all sorts of stresses. So, systemic election reforms. I put in this bucket things like open primaries, the push for ranked choice voting or other systems of preferential voting, Final Four and Final Five voting, and nonpartisan redistricting. These are reforms to the way we vote, and they aim to restructure it to create better incentives, more attractive options for voters, but also better incentives for the people who we are putting in those positions where they have to make important decisions. And since polarization has already been mentioned, that's one of the concerns that these voting reforms often aim to ameliorate. All right, whoops, forward please. So, last 10 years we've seen a whole lot of pushes for election reform. The question is why? I'm a social scientist, so of course I want to know where this is coming from. I got a hypothesis. Is it a nefarious plot by nasty, deep-pocketed interests? No. These reforms and reformers signify basically a market response to our national politics. If people were happy with the governance we were getting, we wouldn't have so many individuals tweaking elections, trying to change them in fundamental ways to hopefully improve outcomes. When I look at reformers, some of whom I have interviewed, they are entrepreneurs. They're trying to build a better mousetrap, one to replace the system of elections that we have used for many, many decades. Now you may say, okay, Kosar, that seems all well and fine. Do you have any evidence of this stuff? Well, I think I got plenty. Dissatisfaction to the public, significant. People are unhappy with government, but they're also unhappy with the two parties that almost inevitably occupy elected positions, the Democrats and the Republicans. We're seeing in recent years an uptick in the number of independents, people who don't like this brand or that brand. Yes, of course, when they go to the voting booth, they will vote Democratic or Republican because typically those are the only choices they have. And they often think if they vote for an independent or something else, they're just throwing their vote away. These numbers look all the more stark when you go for a longer time series. Look at that. Unbelievable. 100 years ago compared to today, people's willingness to affiliate with a particular brand, it's just going down. Ohio. I like to pick Ohio, not just because it's my home state, but also it's a bellwether state. It's a classic middle America sort of state. It's the sort of state that'll send a liberal like Sherrod Brown to the Senate, but then have Rod Portman representing the GOP, and then followed by J.D. Vance. It's a middling place. When voters in Ohio go to register to vote, they don't have to register with a party, as is the case in some places. And so what happens? 77% of voters say, I don't want to associate with either brand. I will not sign up to be a Democrat. I will not sign up to be a Republican. They don't like those choices. Oops, there I go again. Here's another interesting metric. Over the last 50 years, access to voting has greatly improved. We have more early voting. We have more voting by mail. Some of those god-awful structures, Jim Crow-type structures that were stopping people, those have all been wiped away. Are there still hurdles in some places? Yes, there are some hurdles, but the hurdles today are so much lower than they used to be. Yet, people aren't showing up to vote at appreciably higher rates. Yeah, we had a brief jump in the 2020 election, but that was kind of an existential battle. It was during COVID. A lot of people were pretty wound up and worrying about the country sliding into autocracy or anarchy, and they showed up at the polls. But long-term trend is more people are not showing up. They're not happy. Why would they? So this has led these systems entrepreneurs, these people who want to create a better mousetrap, to look at something fundamental. Yeah, you can look at how do we structure our legislature, you can look at presidential powers, you can look at all sorts of stuff to try to improve governance. They're looking at the hiring process. That's the way I like to think about elections. They are a hiring process, and they're saying, is the hiring process we currently have good? Most congressional elections, presidential elections, what we use is the party primary system. Democrats have a primary, Republicans have a primary. If you're affiliated with those parties, you get to go vote. Some states say, yes, if you're an independent, you can come and caucus and vote in those elections. And after that, then we move to a general. Whomever wins in those two get to appear. It's a system that's been around for about 100 years. It really got rolled out widely about by the 1970s. All right, so what's the beef with it? Well, the nerds with whom I flock and hang out, more and more they're finding that primaries are not a great way for picking candidates. Sure, we don't want to go back to the day of smoke-filled rooms where party bosses chomping on cigars would say, okay, you get to be the next candidate for our party. No, that was not a great method of doing it. But this mousetrap ain't so great. Turnout tends to be low, in part because people are excluded if they don't affiliate with a party, in part because of the timing of it. In part, there's also the tenor of these sort of contests. Primaries tend to be exceedingly partisan. They're not pleasant. A lot of voters are turned off by the sheer intensity. When you look at the people who tend to show up and vote in primaries, they're very frequently single-issue voters. They are frequently intense partisans. In short, they're not your average Joe or Jane. So primaries have been a primary target for reformers. They're asking, like, do we have to use this as a selection method? Because the average voter, come general election, you only get what's on the menu. And if the primaries are serving up candidates who are here and here, no surprise that a lot of people just say, I'm not showing up. Neither of these people represent me in any way, shape, or form. I should also mention here another thing that's got the interest of people trying to reform the system and create better incentive structures is the gerrymandering, particularly in the House. This doesn't affect so much at the Senate level because the Senate you vote by state. But at the House level, gerrymandering plus demographic self-sorting plus the way the parties have branded themselves in very kind of intense ways has led to the number of congressional districts where you have like a real competition between Democrats and Republicans, to say nothing of somebody else from another party, it's just going down. 96, 98 out of 435 seats were competitive. There was a chance one person or the other could win. Now, increasingly, there's not many seats. 10%. 10% of seats are competitive. Now, if you think about it, what does that mean if you were to, say, want to run for one of these offices? What would be your incentive structure? Well, your incentive structure is to go all in on the primary. And your incentive structure is to focus your messaging, focus your intention on those voters who show up, the most ideologically intense, the single-issue voters. You get through that, in many of these districts, you hardly have to show up for the general election. You are a shoo-in. So that structure is not conducive to particularly competitive elections or picking people who are anywhere near the mean. So we got a job mismatch. I mean, you all have hired so many people. The worst thing you could do is put the wrong person in the wrong position. And I think primaries often are doing that. You're creating a mismatch. And then Americans sit and they look at their elected officials and are like, why aren't you doing the common sense thing? Why are you taking these kind of wacko positions out there? It's perfectly rational behavior. It looks nuts to the average voter, but it's perfectly rational behavior. They are trying to get through the next primary. And in a place like the House of Representatives, when you only have a 2-year term, as soon as you get to Washington, you're thinking about the next primary. The last thing you want is to be primaried from the right, primaried from the left. And so you got to think about doing all those sorts of things to kind of feed the red meat or feed the vegan non-meat to whichever side of the spectrum that you're trying to keep happy so you don't get dinged. This is a real problem because we're not a parliament. In a parliamentary system, you know, your party gets a majority. You also get to basically take over the executive branch. You often have unicameral legislatures or effectively unicameral legislatures, so you get all the power in that sort of system frequently. That's not our system. Split control of the 2 legislative chambers is the norm these days. Plus, you often have a president in a different party. Unified government is exceedingly rare, and in the Senate, even if you were to have unified government, unless you have 60 senators, you don't have that much power. So our system, by its very nature, requires compromise, but we're not hiring people who represent the median or feel incentivized to compromise. So, changing the hire process. These are some of the reforms that have been thrown into the mix. Some people say we should have open primaries. All party candidates should run in one primary together and all voters should vote. Put them all in there together and try to incentivize these people to, you know, think a little differently about voters and their concerns and not just appeal to one particular niche. Other people say, open primaries are nice, but they're not going to get you where you want to go. You need to have some sort of preferential voting system. What that means is you're able to rank or to choose more than one candidate. And that way, you as a voter are not forced into a simple binary choice, and you're not forced to say, gosh, I really like this candidate over here, but the polls say he doesn't have much of a chance, so I'm not going to send him a check. I'm not going to waste my vote on that person. And instead, I'm just going to give it to whichever is the lesser of 2 evils. Ranked choice voting aims to get rid of that sort of thing, and also to incentivize candidates to run to a bigger pool of voters. Then there's Final Five voting, which combines these 2 ideas. You take an open primary, and the top 4 or top 5 vote getters then move on to the general. And at that election, then you use ranked choice voting to pick amongst them. Finally, there's the push for nonpartisan redistricting, which has been happening all over the country with more and less success. The idea here is that the people should choose the politicians should not choose the voters. And so the idea is you cannot have partisans drawing up election districts, because of course they're going to draw them up in a way that is in their own self-interest and it's exclusionary to other parties. So you kick it over to some sort of board who hopefully will do it in a more neutral, even-handed manner. They've been trying to do that, but of course the great challenge is how do you get that system enacted and keep the politically self-interested people out of it? And how do you preserve it? Because ultimately, both parties kind of have their knives out and are coming for it in many instances. I mean, it's with some amusement that when I look at all these types of reforms I've just mentioned, I can cite instances where in one state, it's the Republicans hating on it. In another state, the very same reform, the Democrats are hating on it, because they're all calculating their own self-interest. They want a system that most advantages them, which kind of is by definition not necessarily the most that advantages you all, or the public at large. So with that, I would say, I'm going to close my remarks, but it's a really, really interesting time. There's a lot of misinformation out there about some of these reforms. People are alleging that there's nefarious things afoot. I don't see it. I don't see evidence for that. I don't see the people who are pushing these sort of electoral reforms as trying to put one over on the public for the sake of advantaging their side. What I see and what the data mostly shows is that these reforms are party neutral. And some of them are showing some good effects. And there's experimentation happening all over. And from my personal standpoint, I would love to see more experimentation in the many laboratories of democracy across this country, in the hopes that we can get people who are better matched for the position and who are more interested in seriously governing as opposed to simply taking partisan stands. Thank you.